Hi, I'm Emily Roger, host of the Boiling Point podcast. My co-host, Dave Vale, and I will bring you thoughtful discussions with leaders who are positively impacting our world. This is The Boiling Point, where leadership and inspiration meet. There we go. We're back. Hi, Dave.
Hello, Emily. Despite how many, we've done hundreds of these, and yet it's always a little embarrassing when the guest is listening to me in particular scramble to try to make the right person the host and all this kind of thing. It's amazing to know that we've actually done this as many interviews as we have over the years, and even just you and I. And previous to that, it was like 6 or 7 years with Greg Hemmings. The challenge is the way to make these successful is to not have me do anything technical, is what I've concluded.
Oh, I think you need to give yourself more credit than that. We always figure it out though. We always get to the record, and there's always sound miraculously.
Yeah. But now I think you've jinxed us, Emily. So hopefully not. Today we got an exciting guest today, don't we?
We do. So Andy Posner is with us. Actually, I said Posner. Maybe it's Posner. We'll get him to actually correct how I then say his name. Andy, welcome. Okay, how do you say your last name? I should have known this.
Oh, no worries. It's Posner, like Edgar Allan Posner.
It is Posner. Okay, that's what I thought. And then I was like, and I've heard your TED Talk. And then I was like, wait a minute, as it came out of my mouth. So welcome to the Boiling Point. Thank you so much for joining us. And you were kind of referred to us by Jackie Russell of Teak Media and Communication, who has also been a fellow guest on the Boiling Point.
Oh, very cool. I didn't know that she had been a guest. That's awesome.
Yeah, she has. We had a really interesting and informative conversation around her, and in reading more about your work and your bio, I can see how you two are connected.
Yeah, well, I'm excited for the conversation.
Yeah, so in typical Boiling Point style, we will have you just introduce yourself. Tell us a bit about you, about Capital Good Fund, and what it is that you are doing.
Yeah, I'll give the brief overview of myself and our work. So I started the organization in February of 2009. At the time, I was getting a master's in environmental studies at Brown University. And I had always been interested in the intersection of poverty, climate, race, and sort of environmental justice writ large. So I was studying financing mechanisms for clean energy. There was a lot of innovation happening in that space at the time. And of course, this was right after the financial collapse. So, when Lehman Brothers went under and people started losing their jobs and homes, I didn't really understand the connection between, Lehman Brothers and a low-income person being laid off, because I don't have a background in finance. My bachelor's is in Spanish, and my goal in high school is to drop out and be a pro tennis player. So I decided to try to research this and understand the link between the two. And that's when I came across the issue of redlining, which was kind of racially discriminatory lending practices, which have continued to this day, although they were outlawed in the 70s. And then I learned about predatory lending, like payday lenders, which charge triple-digit interest rates. So here I was learning about financial services as a tool to unlock, say, clean energy or energy efficiency, realizing it could also be a tool of oppression for minorities and immigrants and low-income people, and decided to start an organization that would really operate at the intersection of those things, which again, aligned with what I was interested in to begin with. So I actually wrote my master's thesis on what I called green microfinance, that then became Capital Good Fund. And when I graduated, I was in a fortunate enough position to be able to give it a go. And, it had legs. One of the advantages I had was that I didn't know any better because I'm not a banker. So a lot of the bankers I talked to, they said, oh, there's no way you can make loans to low-income people and they'll pay you back. And I was like, really though? Is that true? And so what we do as a nonprofit lender is provide financial services to low-income people across a couple different thematic areas, but again, always thinking about upward mobility and uplift and advancing a green economy. So we do loans for things like applying for citizenship or getting a green card. We do loans for residential energy efficiency and solar. And we'll talk a little bit later about our soon to be launched solar leasing program. And then we also have a small dollar consumer program. So think of a domestic violence survivor who needs a loan for a security deposit, or a single dad who needs to fix his car so he doesn't lose his job, and that sort of thing. And we now operate in 10 states. We have lent out $35 million to almost 13,000 families, and our repayment rate is 96.8%. Again, the bankers I met with early on, they said, oh, this will never work. And like I said, and I've just proved them wrong. So it's not that it's been easy, but we're proving that it can work.
I'm so happy we get guests to introduce themselves, because Andy, that was a really excellent introduction. And there's so many pieces of that I'd like to jump into. It was interesting you talk about environmental justice, and before we started recording, the fact that you're in Southern California, there was a big hurricane hit, and we're just talking about climate change and everything that's going on. But tell me, could you shed a little light when when you say environmental justice, what are you meaning by that?
Yeah, it's interesting because 15 years ago, this was a little bit more of a nascent concept. And for many years, I was struggling to get people on board with the idea that a solar loan would connect to our core mission of creating pathways out of poverty. Fortunately, I think people have caught up with that. I mean, basically, you can look at this from a number of angles, but regardless, when you look at who is disproportionately impacted by climate change, directly and indirectly, it's Indigenous people, people of color, people with disabilities, basically marginalized people with less power and less wealth. And so that's true when there's a storm, people who can evacuate versus who cannot. And this was already back when Hurricane Katrina hit. We could see that very visibly. But, when there's extreme heat events, the people that don't have solar and storage, they run out of electricity, or they can't keep their AC on and they die. You look at people who are in areas with more pollution, coal plants and gas plants and cement factories, they're all located in these communities. So across a whole range of thematic areas, there's environmental injustice. So now we're at a place where we have the tools we need to advance a green economy. We have low-cost solar, we have low-cost wind, we have low-cost batteries, even electric vehicle prices are coming down. So the whole question is, are we going to make sure that the benefits of a clean economy are equally shared? Or are we going to have a scenario in which people like myself, I have solar on my roof, I have battery storage, I have electric vehicles, I pay nothing for energy. If there's a power outage, I'm fine. Are all the benefits of that economy going to accrue to people like me and leave the people behind that I serve? Or are we going to really lift all boats, which is an unfortunate, climate-related metaphor, but that's really what it's about. And beyond that, we have the Inflation Reduction Act, but that's not enough to solve the climate crisis. We're going to need, over the next 50 years, continued political buy-in for ongoing policy to implement solutions. And I don't think you can expect that from communities that see no benefit from clean energy. If I'm low income and I go into a rich neighborhood and everyone has a solar panel and none of the people I know have a solar panel, that's one thing. If I have a solar panel and I see it on my neighbors' homes, now I'm literally bought in. If I get a job at a solar manufacturing plant, I'm bought in. And it's not just solar, but just an example. So I feel very strongly about this link between climate and justice.
Okay.
With your loans that you are giving out, and that's a huge payback, 96.8%.
Yeah.
Do you provide like coaching services also that go along with that? Or is it just the funding that you provide through Capital Good Fund?
So we do offer a one-on-one financial and health coaching program, but interestingly, we don't require that people do financial coaching to get a loan. They're separate product offerings with overlap between the two for sure, but there's a very specific reason why we don't require coaching, and it comes down to our philosophical approach to how we treat underserved people. In the nonprofit world, and also just in our economy writ large, there's this attitude that people are poor because they're irresponsible, they're lazy, they don't know how to manage their money. We very much believe that poverty is a function of not having enough money to manage and not a lack of knowledge of how to manage your money. And that's an important distinction. If anything, to be poor in America and stay alive, you have to be more adept at financial management. If Elon Musk buys, I don't know, Twitter and, is burning his money in a dumpster, it doesn't matter. He can still survive that. A low income or poor family in America, one financial misstep, they take out a loan at the wrong interest rate, they buy a computer that breaks, they're in real deep trouble. So it's not to say that our clients can't benefit from understanding how to manage their money, but that's not their fundamental problem. It's just a lack of money. So we really want to get capital into people's hands that's equitable and transparent and responsive, and trust them to do what they need with it.
Okay. Yeah. And I wasn't mentioning that as in that I think that it should be with it. I was just curious because I had heard a video from a lady who had a loan through you, and she spoke about the extra services that she received and what she learned during that process as well.
Of course. And it is a very important part of what we do. We actually initially tried requiring people to get coaching in order to get a loan. And we found that it didn't meet people where they were. And it also didn't really improve repayment rates. So we now have that model where we say, okay, you need a loan right now. We either feel you're in a position to pay it back and succeed with it or not. And then a lot of our most successful clients get a loan. And then, as you saw in that impact video, do financial coaching, because we don't want to just be responsive to emergencies. We do want to build some broader capacity for people to achieve stability.
And it's also, I guess, respectful not to say, you have to do this, because that assumes a lot of things. Correct? I think that's what I'm hearing, sort of maybe philosophically.
It does. It would be a little bit like, for example, right now as we're recording, the Maui is reeling from the fire that destroyed, the city of Lahaina and other parts of the island. It would be a little bit like going to them right now and saying, well, okay, you need money to, eat while you can't go to work and to find loved ones and the like. It would be a little bit like saying, well, but you also need to build a climate resilience plan before we give you the money. The climate resilience plan is essential, but right now they just need the money. And I think that's a similar analogy to how we view, when a low-income person comes to us for capital.
How important do you think it was to maybe you mentioned earlier, like going into this, not knowing what you didn't know. And, I'm guessing maybe a little naive, or the bankers that you talked to would have suggested that. How much value do you think there is sometimes going into something, with a beginner eyes, like that beginner mindset?
I give a lot of talks to high school and college students because I believe very strongly that we need more people to go into the social sector, broadly defined, whether that's government, nonprofits, or social enterprises. And one of the biggest excuses I hear is, well, I need to go and first gain expertise. I need to go work at McKinsey or JP Morgan. And I think that's a fallacious argument for a couple of reasons, one of which is that, as I noted already, they're not necessarily in a better position to solve these problems than I was when I had no experience. The other one is we just don't have time for people to go and gain that experience. Like, there's sort of the net present value of social change, where a life change today is worth more than a life change tomorrow. But the thing I always throw in as a caveat is that doesn't mean you come in without having become an expert in the area. In other words, yes, I didn't have 15 years of lending experience, but I did a lot of research in lending law and underwriting and things like that. So it's not so much a question of being naive. It is a question of being willing to dive into it to begin with. I mean, a lot of people just don't even bother because they just know, quote unquote, know that it doesn't work. But yeah, it's different being a neophyte versus having not done any research.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's a good distinction. I mean, I talk to a lot of entrepreneurs. I would throw myself in there. And probably if I knew what I know now, would have I, embarked on it in the same way? I'm not sure. Like it's an honest, like that's my honest answer. So I'm not sure. And then, and having said that, am I glad I did it? Yeah, 100%. But I didn't anticipate some of the ups, I anticipated some of the ups, but not some of the downs and how low they can be. I don't know if you can relate to that, but that was my sense of when you said that early on.
Yes, that's another thing. Yes, not knowing what I was getting myself into from the vantage standpoint of building and growing and sustaining an entity was certainly to my advantage, because yes, it is. I mean, I've been doing this 15 years. Fortunately, we've been very stable for 4 years, but there were 3 times we almost had to shut down. There's always stressors. So,
Yeah.
but to your point, would I have done it anyways? Yes, I think so. Pretty sure.
Yeah, I love, Dave, how you and I were so often on the same page. If that was exactly what I was thinking, that really stood out around Andy saying it's the advantage of not knowing any better. And even with that, around the like, it gives you permission to do things different because you don't know any other way. And during that, like, who did you really, or like, I would just assume that you would have had to really rely on other people. Like, what does your team look like that's kind of behind Capital Good Fund?
Yeah, well, and one of the reasons I give talks to college students as well is that they have access to, they're in a very privileged position, regardless of what university they go to. One, they don't, I mean, a lot of students have to work, but they have more ability to take risk because they don't have a family yet, they don't have a mortgage. And if you're a college student, you can call up the CEO of a local bank. I remember reaching out to the CEO of Bank Rhode Island, and they're willing to take a meeting with you because you're just a student, you're trying to learn. And so I talk to college students about taking advantage of those resources available to you, which become a little harder to tap into once you've graduated and have different pressures. So I was fortunate that Brown had a director of social entrepreneurship named Alan Harlem, who coincidentally was also looking at this idea of US-based microfinance. And he really took me under his wing and helped me, because I'd never done community outreach. So he helped me set up focus groups, and I speak Spanish. So we did focus groups in the Latino community. He helped me understand, like, how do you create a board of directors and incorporate a nonprofit and apply for tax-exempt status. But there are people who respond to authenticity, again, particularly if you're a student or just a young person, or what have you, whatever age, and that's not the age, but just, that people can tell what your motivations are. And the biggest thing is be willing to ask. And I was not shy at all because I wasn't selling widgets. I was trying to sell opportunity. Mm-hmm. So there were all sorts of people that opened doors. And again, because I was a student, our first staff, quote unquote, was undergraduates at Brown who were our initial workforce. And then we got AmeriCorps Vistas. And for several years, we had myself and Vistas. And the AmeriCorps program is incredible. We don't have time to get into it, but folks should definitely look at that if you're a nonprofit. And then the other thing I tell people is your job as a leader isn't to be an expert in every element. It's to create a vision around which people cohere to raise the funds, but then you bring in experts. So I have my CFO has decades of experience in accounting and financial services, and my underwriting team and that sort of thing. So that's the other thing, is if you want to start an organization, the kind of expertise you need is different from, obviously, if you want to be a coder, you need to learn to code, right? But I didn't need to understand how to run a bank in order to start the organization. I needed to have a vision and then bring in the right people to implement it.
Your comments around university students is really resonating. I just went on some tours with my son, and I'll tell you, I was like, man, I should go back to school. Like, everything felt so fresh, like I don't know, I was soaking it in, and I started recognizing, like, man, if I wish when I was to school when I was younger, I had maybe the wisdom that I have now as a 51-year-old. And just the fact that, anyways, it was very exciting, but that's a really good point. People can reach out and ask questions and get meetings. And I find, if you're in that startup phase or if you're a university student, that makes a lot of sense. But, there's some really interesting background on like microfinancing and kind of where it started for listeners that maybe aren't familiar with that. Can you share the origin story?
Yeah, and just to wrap up the other piece, one thing I noticed, like, college students are great at coming up with ideas, most of which are not workable, and they don't have the experience to know why. But that's where having someone like Alan Harlem that could be a sounding board and say, okay, for you to do this, here are the 10 things you need to think about. And then I go, so it's not workable, or it is, So anyways, just wanted to add that. But yeah, the origin story of microfinance is really interesting. So it kind of started in two places. I'll focus on Dr. Muhammad Yunus, since he won the Nobel Peace Prize for being, quote, the father of microfinance. So in his case, he was an economist in Bangladesh. I think this was in the wake of a famine in the 70s. And he was talking to women in the village about why they were struggling, and because they had businesses that seemed to be succeeding. And what he learned basically was that in order to, to buy a cow, or if you were a weaver to buy your raw materials, they would have to take it out a loan. And the loans were at such high interest rate that almost all of their profits were going toward the money lender. And so the famous story is that he lent out something like $26 was his first loan at very low interest to help these women buy what they needed without the usurious interest rates. And he just watched them be able to succeed with that. So he eventually turned that into what's now called Grameen Bank. And he pioneered this group lending model where women would form groups, and there was some mutual responsibility and accountability. And it was extraordinarily successful, to the point that, unfortunately, a lot of venture capitalists and private equity companies realized that, oh, you could make a lot of money doing this. And so now there's kind of two types of microfinance. There's the Muhammad Yunus style, which is truly mission-oriented, and just his whole approach is to charge an interest rate that covers your costs, and that's it. He doesn't even believe in any profit when it's related to serving the poor. But now in India, there was a famous example many years ago of very large for-profit microfinance company that was charging such high interest rates and was pressuring people to the point that there were mass suicides because people couldn't bear the stress of their collection practices. So it kind of created a bit of a beast because of how successful his model is. But what he found is that when you did this, the women paid back, and he focuses on women. And in whatever context you see that, I mean, it's very popular in Latin America and Asia, all over the world. And lastly, I'll note, in the US, the iteration of microfinance is primarily done through what's called community development financial institutions, or CDFI, which we are one. That is a US Treasury designation. It's a certification. You can be a bank, credit union, or just nonprofit lender and be a CDFI. And that was actually started by Bill Clinton when he was president in 1994. And he learned about Muhammad Yunus when he was governor of Arkansas. So he was a big proponent of that model.
Okay.
You spoke of being in 10 states. Do you have, is it a goal to expand to different states? Are you wanting to share your model with other organizations? Like, where do you see Capital Good Fund going, or where do you want it to go?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I was just talking to my general counsel this morning. One of the challenges for us is that we're not a depository, so we don't take deposits. We're regulated state by state, and there are varying levels of onerousness associated with being a lender in those states. So there's a limitation. Like, for example, in California, where I live, it probably would take us a year to get a lending license, and we probably don't have the capacity to just keep up with all the compliance rules. We are very eager to help other organizations replicate our model. I very much believe in the kind of Creative Commons approach to social impact. But it's difficult. There aren't a lot of organizations that really want to take on our model. So in terms of what our goal is, when I started the organization, I had, I think, 3 core goals. The first one, of course, was to achieve our mission. The second one was to do it at a scale that could make a dent in the problem of poverty and climate. And the third was for us to get to a scale at which the revenue we generate from our activities could cover our costs, so that we're not dependent on grants in perpetuity, which are fickle and fluctuating and onerous in their own way. So right now, we're about 30% of our revenue comes from the interest that we charge on our loans, which is very modest. And we're trying to get that to 100% by 2026. So, I think we've proven our model, and now it's really about scaling it up and generating some economies of scale. We don't need to add more states. There's plenty of people to be served in our 10 markets, although we are going to start lending in Pennsylvania in the next couple of months.
So, and is there like, as you describe the state by state approach, it almost like maybe on the outside, it seems like there's systemic issues that almost create obstacles to do this kind of work. And actually, I'd like you to comment on predatory lending as well, if you could. But just, that's what it sounds like. I mean, is there any truth to that?
Yeah, federalism does create some challenges in the US. Yeah, it's definitely a barrier. I mean, even, if you're a depository, if you take, if you're a bank or credit union, you deal with your own set of regulatory challenges. Like, but if you're a federally chartered bank, say, you don't have to get a license in each state. But as you can imagine, the FDIC and the Federal Reserve have very, as they should, stringent requirements. So it's a challenge regardless of the approach you take. Predatory lending is interesting because this is where we start to get into political power. Up until the early 90s, there was no such thing as a payday loan, for example. That was something that people cooked up because other ways to generate revenue through lending were drying up. So a payday loan, for example, is a typically $300 to $500, maybe $700 loan. And the idea is that you're getting advance against your next paycheck, effectively. So you go to a payday lender, you give them a post-dated check, and the idea is in 2 weeks, you might pay back $330 on a $300 loan. And that did not exist. In Rhode Island, for example, that's called a deferred presentment loan, and there was a carve-out created in the law to allow that. So any other type of lender has to follow one set of rules, like the max interest rate's 30%, so on and so forth. If you're a deferred presentment or payday lender, you can charge an equivalent APR of 261%.
Oh my.
And the reason is that, you pay something like $12 per $100 you borrow, which sounds reasonable, right? Again, I lend you $300 today, you pay back $330 in 2 weeks. What happens? Most people who can't come up with $300 today cannot come up with $330 in 2 weeks. And the payday lenders know that, so they say, no problem, we'll give you a new loan. Now your new loan is for $330, probably plus some fees. And then the average person recycles that over and over and over again. So a $300 loan, if you keep it out for 9 months, ends up costing you $700, say, in interest and fees. Wow. And, that is money that people cannot afford. One of the most stunning statistics I've seen, and this predates inflation, is that a family making $26,000 a year in the US, which is poverty, spends as much on interest and fees and financial services writ large as it does on food, about 10% of income. So when we think about, lending out at the highest interest rate we charge is 15.99 compared to 200, 300, 400% and more. That's money that literally goes to food on the table, keeping the lights on, school supplies and so on. But payday lending now and those types of, there are different flavors, auto, title, and rent to own. It's roughly a $200 billion industry in the US. And one of our other outcomes is policy change. I don't believe that you can social enterprise your way out of the problems that we face. You need to marry private sector with public policy. So a good example is in Illinois. They had been trying for a number of years to get rid of predatory lending. I think the legal limit was like 540% APR. And that is not, I did not misspeak, 540. When the bill was heard in 2021, it was called the Predatory Loan Prevention Act. The legislature was asking, well, if we get rid of payday lending and predatory lending, are there alternatives? So our role is to come in and say, yes, we have a product. And so we were mentioned on the floor of the House and Senate. That bill was passed. It established a 36% rate cap on all loans in the state. That is saving Illinois families $50 million a year in interest and fees. And that's a really good example of what I'd like to see it happen at the national level. There's legislation proposed every year in the Senate and the House to establish a national 36% rate cap. But the political power of the industries that make a ton of money off these high interest rates pushes back. And even in Rhode Island, by the way, we have failed to get rid of payday lending for 11 straight years because of the financial clout of the industry.
You spoke of your dream about being a tennis pro. When you look back, it's like, what like kind of skill sets or what characteristics within yourself do you see that you had in order to now take you to where you are today and ultimately what you were able to be doing? I mean, it's like you're not serving a tennis ball, like you are serving an entire like 10 states of population of people who are incredibly need. What do you think is it within you that has made it so that you can be where you are today?
Oh, I love this question. Because I don't get to speak to it a lot. You know, it's really funny. I always had this sense, because my parents put me in private school. You know, my parents are both Jewish with PhDs, and so there's a certain expectation about what your career path looks like. And I think I always felt like I was on this conveyor belt that was supposed to take me through private school and then Harvard and then become a doctor or something like that, right? And I always rebelled against that feeling of being on a conveyor belt. So there was like something, and I think it was more intrinsic, that I always wanted to step off of that. And it was the willingness to step off the conveyor belt that really enabled the rest of it. Like I've always said, I'm not just going to keep going this way. And for listeners, I'm just pointing ahead. I'm willing to step off. And then, so I think my desire to be a tennis player was my attempt, before I had anything more concrete, to say, I want to step off and try something different. I was very talented. My heart wasn't quite in it. I was also undiagnosed bipolar. And so I couldn't focus enough. But then the transformational moment for me was in 10th grade. I had an English professor who modeled himself after Dead Poets Society. Like he wanted to be Robin Williams, but he introduced me to romantic poetry with capital R and philosophy. And that was like, okay, these were people rebelling against the norm, but they were doing it in a way that was creating art and beauty and, you know, ideas. And that kind of, and then I started reading Transcendentalism and, you know, Emerson and Thoreau. And so now my mind's starting casting about I see alternatives to the conveyor belt, and I was open to finding something new. And the seminal moment for me was the lead up to the war in Iraq. So this was 2002, 2003. That was when things gelled in terms of giving something more concrete to my desire to step off that conveyor belt, because I got interested in the protest movement. And at the time, the motto was, or the slogan people were chanting was, "No war for oil." I don't know in hindsight if it was a war about oil, but I said, okay, I was not able to stop the war personally. I'm going to protest by trying not to use oil. So I stopped driving, and that really got me. That was my first entree into the environmental movement. But my entree to environmentalism wasn't about saving trees, as important as that is. It was about the link between that and war and public policy. And then everything went from there. But really, all of that stemmed back from that initial desire to say, wait a minute, hold on a second. I remember when I was an undergraduate, I had a professor of logic. And on the first day, he said, if you learn nothing else in this class, it's that you should question everything. And then he paused for an uncomfortably long time. And he said, how come none of you question that statement? Right. And so that really resonated with me as well, because it really, for me, has been that, even though I didn't speak up in that moment, of just questioning everything, including like fundamentally, like the things that undergird our society and what's expected of us.
Yeah.
You mentioned being diagnosed bipolar. Like, so what super strengths has that given you, you think, as it relates to what you do? And it was really interesting to hear you light up around your story. Like the energy shifted big time. Not that it wasn't good before, but it was this next level. You know, and your path. So, and I'm just wondering how being bipolar, that having that diagnosis, how did that help? How has that helped you?
Yeah, and I think I was lucky because I have the more mild form of bipolar. You know, the more severe form, you can have psychosis when you have manic episodes. I never had that, but I think during moments of hypomania, you know, your brain just, and I'm medicated now, so I'm much more stable, because really it did start to get to a point in my mid-20s, because I'd still not been diagnosed. I'm a poet, so everyone was just like, oh, that's what poets are like. And I was starting to get to a point where I couldn't handle the ups and downs that well, and I got medicated and stable. But during moments of hypomania, there's something that happens in your brain where you just feel connections between things. And it's very liberating and powerful. And if you can kind of bottle that and turn it into something concrete and productive, it's very powerful. And I am a published poet, and I think there are a lot of poets that are bipolar. Like Robert Lowell is a very famous American poet who had extremely severe bipolar to the point it became debilitating. But I was lucky in the level I got just enough. It's a little bit like sometimes people take like psilocybin, to kind of free up their mind and make those connections. I just had that, and I was lucky in that sense.
I love that. Lucky, you know what I mean? And just recognizing what it brought to you. That's amazing.
But I'm also lucky because, my parents, my mom grew up dirt poor in Ukraine. My dad was lower middle class, but I never worried about money. I didn't come out of college with a lot of debt. And so I was able to take advantage of that. Now, I know a lot of people from my private school days who had a lot of money and their only goal was to make more money. So it's not a guarantee that you would do that, but still, I was very fortunate to be in a position where I could pursue something like Capital Good Fund. I wish that more people, there are probably 1,000 people like me who don't have that opportunity, who would take advantage of it if they could. And that's where things like AmeriCorps Vista and different fellowship programs can be so transformational, because we do need more people working in this sector, as I said earlier. I feel very strong, like we know how to solve climate change and poverty and hunger and all these things. We just don't have enough people implementing it, and we don't have and that becomes a function of political will and who's lobbying for and who's working in these spaces.
Yeah. Andy, how do more people find out, for one, about Capital Good Fund? But for people who are also curious they have this dream, they have this like big idea, what direction would you guide them in being able to kind of put together all the puzzle pieces to make what might seem really big and daunting and like such a difficult task to be able to achieve, to get it to the point of being able to have a program?
So the first one, I'll start with the more vague one, which is somehow you need to internalize what I always point out is like, when you die, you're not going to put on your tombstone that like I paid off my student loans in a certain amount of time. You do have to be willing to take risks. And I guess I recognize I'm in a privileged position to say that, but still you do have to be willing to step off that conveyor belt, which can be very uncertain because you're not stepping onto terra firma necessarily. So you do have to be willing to go into the unknown. But the other thing is that you have to ask. Every time I give a talk, I tell people, here's my cell phone, here's my email. If you want to talk to me about an idea, you want a book recommendation, you want an internship, contact me. I'm not going to contact you. I don't know you. No one's going to give me a grant if I don't ask for it. And people have to get over that. Just remember, you're not selling widgets. I mean, if you're trying to sell widgets, I don't care. I'm not going to help you, but you have to be willing to go out and look at the resources. There are so many people in every sphere of life doing good. They will talk to you. There are podcasts like this, there's books, there's blog posts, there's articles, there are, go to your university, community groups. I mean, we have Google, we have AI, ask ChatGPT for all the resources that are out there. Well, sort of kidding, but it's just a question of like email, call, and you have to be like a dog with a bone when it comes to your vision. I always point out to college students when I give my talks that often it feels like we spend more time researching what movie we're going to watch next than we do plotting out our career. So the thing I encourage people to do, even if you're changing careers, create a mission statement for yourself. Like for me, it was my mission is to operate at the intersection of poverty, race, gender, and climate. And create a rubric for yourself, because the last thing you want to do is be presented an opportunity like to go work for McKinsey, not tie it back to your mission statement and your values. And 20 years from now, you find yourself, I actually have a book on my desk. It's called When McKinsey Comes to Town. And it's all the ways that McKinsey has, helped the oil industry and the tobacco industry perpetuate injustice. You don't want to find yourself in that situation 20 years from now. But man, the resources are out there. You just have to go out there and be relentless in pursuing those things. Again, if you're just trying to get rich, like people are going to tell and they're not going to want to help you. But if you're doing it with authenticity for a bigger purpose, man, people want to open doors for you.
So the one thing we missed is how people learn more about Capital Good Fund.
Oh, yes, of course. So, I mean, they can go to capitalgoodfund.org.
Okay.
And, there are a number of ways that people can get plugged in. If you live in one of the 10 states we operate in, you can apply for a loan, you can get financial coaching. Of course, people can donate right through our website. But also one of the key things that we do right now is we raise debt to finance our loans. And so people can make an impact investment. We have a couple different vehicles, but the basic idea is you lend us money, we use it to change lives, and we pay you interest. The interest rate that we offer depends on a couple different factors. It's not going to be the same as if you lent to, I don't know, ExxonMobil, but it's still reasonable and has the benefit of being high impact. And so there's a contact form on their website. You can also email me. It's andy@capitalgoodfund.org. And I assume you could put that in the show notes. But yeah, definitely encourage people to reach out and find ways. I mean, we have opportunities for board service. Oops, sorry about that. We have opportunities for board service. We have opportunities for internship. We're always hiring. So there's a lot of ways to get plugged in with our work.
Awesome. I love that high impact giving too. That's some other point. Love to tell you about the $1 million pledge, and just nothing as sophisticated as what you're doing, but just interesting way to bring a group of people together to create a fund that impacts our local kind of area and community. I think there's a lot to that, and people do feel good about that, and I think don't really recognize the options to do that because they're not always presented. So I'm so happy you shared that. Before we're going to go to takeaways in a moment. I expect Emily will wrap up with that. But is there a story you can share? Like, you're a storyteller. Like you're like, I love how you share your story, but just in terms of maybe something that has kept you going, a story about a client that was served in a way, or something that you can share just to put a face to what some of the what you're doing and what Capital Good Fund does.
We have so many. I mean, as the son of an immigrant, well, our immigration loan is one of my favorites. And we had one gentleman that came to us who, he was from Africa. I forget which country. He was Senegal. He's from Senegal. And he'd been here for many years, but his family was in Senegal. And so we gave him a loan to do what's called a family petition, where in America, he or she that has the best lawyer wins. And so he could not afford a good lawyer. We provided a loan to hire an excellent lawyer who was able to succeed in winning his family petition. We also included in that loan, once he won the case, money to fly his family over here. And so we were able to reunite the whole family, and now they're pursuing the American dream. Another example, a recent one comes to mind, is there was a woman who during COVID had a whole set of tragedies: divorce, got COVID, there was a fire, she ended up in a burn unit, and we gave a small loan just so she could kind of keep things together. Then as she was recovering, she got another loan to buy a computer to just start to rebuild her life. She then got financial coaching. And so she talks about how she was at her lowest point, and had, absent our loan, she could have very easily ended up homeless. And now she's in a place of stability and doing coaching and building a plan to rebuild her credit and that sort of thing. And I mean, we have myriad stories like that, which I'm glad you prompt me, because as an entrepreneur, you can very easily get lost in I have a board meeting and I have to file this compliance report, and you forget to what end you're doing all of that work.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And sometimes I have in my own personal experience, and we offer coaching services, executive coaching services and leadership coaching. And sometimes you're in it and you're going, why am I doing this? And then someone will contact you and say, oh, I was, working with Emily, or, one of the coaches, and you go, oh, this is why I'm doing it. Yeah, right. But I love those stories, and it's important and I imagine there's, hundreds, if not thousands of them. So we got to unfortunately wrap things up because there's so much more to talk about. So over to you, Emily.
Yeah. So Andy, at the end of all of our Boiling Point podcasts, we both do takeaways. And so Dave, what is your takeaway from our conversation today with Andy?
Okay. You're a Renaissance man. There's a lot to that I could jump into, but I like to question everything. It's kind of ties into, for me, being, trying to remain curious, and, even when you think, question it. Right. Because I think it's, for me anyways, I've kind of, as as I age, I start to like look at the world in a certain way, and it's like, what? Wait a sec, should I look at it this way? So I think that, and just this idea of stepping off the conveyor belt. And I, you talk about going to private school, and you said, you felt really fortunate, but like, a lot of people, even very fortunate, can't get off that conveyor belt. And a lot of times we're coaching them in their 50s and 60s are saying, like, I feel unfulfilled. I didn't ever, establish a mission. I kind of just followed a path. So the combination of those two things would be certainly big takeaways for me. What about you?
Yeah, the conveyor belt analogy for sure. And it's interesting because sometimes I'll use the conveyor belt analogy with even just like if I'm laying in bed at night and cannot stop thinking about a certain thing. It's that like, okay, envision it on a conveyor belt and just let it fall off and then let it fall off. But that ability to actually be willing to get off the conveyor belt. And, it's like that question of like, me asking you about tennis and your desire, your dream to be a tennis player, that like, and even hearing you speak about that, it reminds me of just even giving yourself permission to have those dreams. And by you giving yourself permission to do that, even though that wasn't necessarily where you went, it then opened up an even bigger avenue of other places to still be able to explore. But yeah, when we just don't even give ourselves that space to think differently, and the importance around speaking and sharing and speaking to high school students, speaking to people even younger than that, of just like sharing our story about how we got to where we are, to encourage other people to really explore different avenues. So thank you so much. And we will have all of your information and any extras that we discussed in the show notes for our listeners. And the best place for everyone to find that is on our website at boilingpointpodcast.com. We're active on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and we put the video version YouTube on Facebook and YouTube. I said YouTube. And of course, our podcast is available on all of your favorite podcast platform. So Andy, thank you so much. This was such a pleasure. I look forward to keeping in touch with you and seeing where else your organization goes.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thank you for listening. Follow or subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app or visit boilingpointpodcast.com for more.